Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Whole Self series. I'm so excited that you guys got to joining me today. If you guys weren't able to check out last week's video on spiritual disciplines and strategies to regulate emotions, or even if you weren't able to check out the Whole Self seminar on mental health that we did on April 25th, I highly encourage you to go check out those videos, either here on Facebook, if you can scroll down to them, or you can check them out on our Facebook page or on the app and on YouTube, and you can watch those and kind of get caught back up. But if you're actually joining me today, we're actually going to be continuing this topic on a Christian perspective on mental health with this whole self idea by talking about the topic of vulnerability. Now, I know the topic of vulnerability scares a lot of people because we don't really want to be vulnerable with people. We don't want to, allow ourselves to be hurt because most of us are familiar with this idea that the definition of vulnerability means being open and susceptible to attack or hurt, either physically attacked, physically hurt, or emotionally. But there is a better definition that we're going to be working with today when we talk about this idea of vulnerability. And this is the better definition for talking about vulnerability when we talk about mental health. And that is the willingness to show emotion or to allow one's weakness to be seen or known. Willingness to risk being hurt or attacked. See, the key to stable and positive mental health is having a foundation in honesty, trust, and, you've guessed it, vulnerability with others regarding our emotions. This idea of vulnerability is key to providing that solid foundation, being willing to risk being hurt for the idea that it could strengthen us and provide us something better. So first we're going to look at what vulnerability looks like in the brain, because there are actual, physical vulnerabilities that people have. Being vulnerable, being open to getting hurt, being open to attack. Those are actual real possibilities. We're vulnerable people as human beings. And we actually have that in our brains as well. See, if you remember during the Whole Self seminar back in April, Dr. Jenny Sears mentioned this idea of pruning. Pruning is something that happens in the brain during adolescence that actually, leaves our minds vulnerable, because what it does is it is cleaning out all of the cobwebs in the brain. Throughout childhood, we're learning so much, so frequently, all the time, and we're just storing everything we can possibly learn in our brains. And during adolescence, our brains go through this pruning process to weed out things that we've learned but aren't necessary anymore, or things that, really we don't really need. We've developed to a point where those aren't necessary anymore, and we get rid of them. And while we're getting rid of those, we're strengthening the connections in our brains about things we've learned that are important, so that when we go into adulthood, we've strengthened our mind and we've opened it up to learning new things. It's a vital process in brain development and just development in general. But because it's getting rid of certain things in our brains, it's allowing itself to be vulnerable for stress to come in and for excess pruning to happen. So our brains can accidentally get rid of the things that are vital and crucial to our development, things that we should have kept, but because of excess stress and anxiety, we've gotten rid of them, and we've kept things that we probably shouldn't have kept. This excess pruning idea, this stress and vulnerability, can lead to a number of mental health concerns and even mental disorders like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and anxiety disorders. However, there is a good side to this. Vulnerability, this type of vulnerability in our mental state, is a necessary part of development. It's necessary for us to grow, for us to mature, and for us to actually learn and strengthen our mind. That next step into getting a positive, healthy mental state is this vulnerability state that we all have to go through at some point in our lives. Our minds are built to withstand this. We're not just vulnerable because we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable because it's necessary. And so God has designed our brains to support ourselves during that vulnerable state. It designed so that while one part of our brain is vulnerable to stress, the rest of our brain is overcompensating for it. So that even if you kick one leg out from the table still stands, still supports everything, and we can still develop and learn normally and healthily. It's this idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So even if you get rid of one part and that part is left vulnerable, the whole as it is stands strong. And if we're able to go through this idea of vulnerability to allow ourselves to strengthen, then it actually improves our mental state and provides a positive foundation. If we were to just never go through this vulnerable state of pruning, we would never develop properly, and we would never be able to strengthen our minds for what's to come. This vulnerable state actually strengthens us, and it's this idea of vulnerability that we want to talk about today. Vulnerability in our minds and vulnerability with our emotions allows us to change, adapt, move forward, which is something we just talked about this Sunday in church, because it's giving us the opportunity to do so. Vulnerability, whether that's physically or emotionally or mentally or spiritually, opens up and provides the opportunity for us to change for the better, adapt to new environments, move forward, and strengthen our physical state, our mental state, and our spiritual states. Vulnerability allows our brains to what it calls remodel itself, which is a crucial part of stabilizing our mental states for growth. It's necessary to stabilize our mental health. And if we go through life thinking this idea of vulnerability is wrong, then we can never access that point of ourselves that requires stabilizing. Actually being healthy, and when especially mentally healthy, requires us to be vulnerable at some point, requires us to be vulnerable in some things, allows ourselves to open up, to change, fix, find the problems, and grow and become healthy. And that goes both from being mentally healthy and spiritually healthy. They both require some form of vulnerability. See, vulnerability is the key to true connection. Vulnerability is taboo in our culture. We find it means you're weak. We find it means you're unworthy of anything, because we think being vulnerable means that we're going to be hurt, means that we're going to be attacked, means that we're going to somehow fail all the time. But that's not what it means. See, vulnerability comes with shame. And shame is this fear of disconnect. And when we feel ashamed of ourselves, of our emotions, of things we've go through, things we've done, it often leads to distance between us and other people, distance between us and God, and misunderstandings between us. Shame is not the solution to anything. Vulnerability is. See, shame is more likely to be the cause of several behavioral issues and negative mental health. See, when we keep emotions in, that can never be the solution to our problems. Keeping everything bottled up is never the answer. Letting go of them, being able to voice them, being able to live through them, this idea of being vulnerable with them, that's the only way to come out of all of those negative things, those bad life decisions, those risks of our health to our behavior, just all of the things that are weighing us down. Being vulnerable is the only way to get out of them. It's the only way to make a real connection between us and other people, between us and our emotions, and between us and God. Vulnerability is what leads to worthiness, not unworthiness. See, that's where we kind of get a problem. Vulnerability does not equal being unworthy. In fact, it's the opposite. When we're vulnerable, we're open to being worthy. And they both mean facing uncertainty, exposure, and emotional risks to the point that we can then know that we are enough. When we go through uncertainty, when we expose ourselves to the light, when we expose our hidden and our darkness to something better, when we go through something that's risky, emotionally actually opening ourselves up, it's what allows us to know that we are worthy, that we are enough, and that we can make real connections with other people. Because when we're on the same playing field, when I'm able to open up with someone and tell them things that I don't want them to know, it leads to empathy, that leads to compassion, that leads to strengthening us and hope and healing, not to just labeling, not just to crushing us down, because those aren't the answers to anything. Vulnerability is. See, vulnerability brings courage, compassion, and connections with it, wherever we allow vulnerability to access our inner parts. See, it brings the courage to tell our stories, the compassion for ourselves and not just others, and actual real connections with other people. See, vulnerability is the key to connection because it's the birthplace of true joy. You know, I don't know if you remember this, but back in December, I preached about this idea of joy. And I mentioned that joy isn't just something that happens. You know, it's not the same as happiness. It is something that is birthed from pain and struggles. It's something that comes out of living through all of that negative things, all through the pain, the struggles, the sorrow, you know, everything. When we're able to live through that, real joy comes out of it because we are dependent on God, because we know that even in the midst of that pain and those struggles, God still works in us, that we still have worth. And when we're vulnerable enough to admit that, that's where real strength happens. It's the fire, like the kiln in pottery. It's the thing that hardens us, strengthens us, makes us, you know, powerful, makes us unique. We're no longer just weak, we're strong. We're not just moldable, but we are firm. We have a foundation, and all of that comes from vulnerability, not from feeling ashamed, not from hiding it away, but from being open about those things. It is only in the midst of pain and struggle that we can find true victory, especially victory in God. We only have to be willing to enter into that by being vulnerable with not only ourselves and not only with God, but with the people that are around us. We're a community, a faith community for a reason. The people you go to church with, the people here at Northside, are here for you. They're your support when you're vulnerable, just like you're their support when they're vulnerable. Each of us are able to hold each other up when we fall because we're strong together, because we're willing to be vulnerable so that we can become stronger, so that we can depend on God's grace and we can grow and we can mature and we can be strengthened in his love for us. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10 is one of the greatest verses in the Bible when it talks about vulnerability. And it comes from Paul saying, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." See, it's not about being strong and hiding all of our weaknesses. It's about admitting that we are weak so that we can grow and be strong. Because when we admit we have weaknesses, we can use them, we can fix them, we can deal with them, we can be open with them, we can adapt around them, and that's what strengthens us. Hiding those weaknesses away does nothing but make us more vulnerable to hurt. It makes us more vulnerable to sin, and it's not the kind of vulnerability that we want. We don't want to be vulnerable to hurt and attack. We want to be vulnerable with ourselves so that we can grow from them. One thing that's said about this verse that I really love is, but he was only strong because he knew his weaknesses and he looked outside himself for the strength of God's grace. See, strength doesn't come from putting on a mask. Strength doesn't come from hiding things in a closet. Strength, real strength, comes from taking that risk to being vulnerable with someone and noticing that they're there for you. And even if they're not there for you, being vulnerable with yourself opens your minds, opens your body to being accepting of yourselves, and strengthens that connection you have with God, even if the rest of the world isn't in support of you. Name it Detainment is an idea that I learned when I was studying, mental health and faith at Olivet. It's this idea that if you put a name to what you're going through, that's going to be the only way for you to deal with it, for you to admit to it, for you to grow out of it. Learning to deal with emotions means being aware of them, means modifying them inside us so that we can think clearly. When it comes to our mental states, when you're feeling anxious or depressed, actually saying it out loud, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, I'm depressed, I'm not doing okay, is the first step saying, okay, now I can deal with it. Because if all we do is hide it away in ourselves and pretend that we're fine, we're never going to have to deal with it. We're just covering up and saying, I'm fine. But when it comes to real strength, that has to come from putting a name to it, to saying it out loud, saying it to other people, and then being forced to actually deal with it. Being willing to admit that we have weaknesses and that we have negative emotions opens us up to actually fixing them, using them, and growing from them. Saying out loud our emotions and our problems actually helps balance our brain's emotional intensity. There's actual proof in the chemistry of our brain that says when you put a name to what's happening in your minds, it reduces the negative effects that they have. It actually strengthens positive connections in the brain. It turns the tides in our brain from, having, those negative emotions be our primary thing, so that, when we're dealing with anxiety, actually naming that anxiety helps reduce anxiety in us. It calms the minds, it reduces stress, it relaxes our muscles, and actually helps us go, wait, I can deal with this now. It's not just something that's causing, stress and causing us pain. It's something that we can actually handle because we've put a name to it and we're willing to deal with it. Vulnerability does not mean weakness. Yes, vulnerability allows us to admit we have weaknesses, but when we're being vulnerable, it doesn't mean we're being weak. There is no being weak unless you hide them away. That's what weakens us. It's pretending like they don't exist. Vulnerability does not mean weaknesses. It means emotional risk. It means emotional courage. It means being willing to admit our weaknesses so that they can actually one day become our strengths. Because if you remember Paul saying, for when I am weak, then I am strong. That's all it is. When I am weak, then I am strong. When I am vulnerable, I can then heal. And so when it comes to our mental health and our spiritual health, the very first step we have to consider before we go through everything else is we have to admit that we're struggling. We have to admit that there's a problem. We have to admit that we're not as put together as we'd like people think. We have to admit that we're vulnerable. Because once we do that, then we can open ourselves up for new hope and from healing. And we can strengthen the connections we have with God and with our faith community around us. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. But before I let you go, I mentioned last week that part of, this whole self series is me actually sharing with you some other recommendations for you guys to maybe look into if you want to explore some of these topics a little bit deeper. And I have some recommendations for you today. I've got a couple of book recommendations as well as a couple of TED Talk recommendations for you. So whether or not you're a reader or whether you just want to listen to something, there's an option for you to get some more in-depth talk about this idea of vulnerability. Some of the book recommendations I have for you are this. This book is called Vulnerable Community, and it's the theology of disability and hospitality. It's a great book for understanding, this idea of vulnerability, especially when it comes to people who have, disabilities, whether that's a physical disability or even a mental disability, like negative mental health or not strong mental health. So I think that's a great book that you can take. It's a little bit of a tough read, but it's a fantastic, resource for you to have. Another one that I have is my copy of The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke-Harris. And this is a book that Dr. Jenny Sears recommended during the Whole Self seminar that we did. And this is the book that's written on the adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, that we mentioned during one of the sessions. So if you want to get a better idea into that and how those adverse childhood experiences allow us to be a little bit vulnerable and help us go through that process, this is a fantastic read. Nadine Burke-Harris also has a TED Talk that you can look at. It's her TED Talk on introducing the ideas of ACEs. We watched a brief clip of it during Dr. Jenny Sears' presentation on ACEs, and you can check that one out as well. The last book that I have is called Brainstorm. Now, this is a book written by Daniel Siegel, who is someone that Dr. Jenny Sears recommended as well. She didn't necessarily recommend this book, but she did recommend the author. And so I'm recommending this book if you would like to get a better understanding of how the human brain works when it goes, it's designed for teenage brains, or the brain during adolescence, but it gives you a great understanding of how your brain has developed, even if you're an adult, how your brain has gotten to that point of adulthood. It's written really well so that anyone can read it. It has tools in it called MindSight tools for you to go through. The breathing exercise we did is in this book. Some other great tools are in here. And this has a great section on the brain during vulnerability and how it leads to opportunity. Another TED Talk that I want to recommend is there's 2 TED Talks by Brené Brown, who is a researcher who dedicated a lot of her research to this idea of vulnerability. She's got her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, and the TED Talk, Listening to Shame, that I highly recommend for this topic. She's also got a few books that you can check out. They're all on the topic of vulnerability, and they bring up this idea of vulnerability from multiple different angles. And so I highly, highly recommend that you listen to her TED Talks, listen to her audiobooks, or get her books to read for understanding this topic of vulnerability more in depth. All right, so that's all I've got for you today. Join us next week as we continue this topic of the Whole Self series. We're going to be jumping into another topic on the Christian perspective on mental health, and then we'll have one more week of this as we wrap up this series throughout the month of May. So until then, I'll see you later. Bye.